He stood among the crowd, feeling their contempt in every glare aimed at his frayed coat and tangled beard. With a single, shocking offer, he claimed the scorned horse, leaving every critic speechless. The midday sun burned fiercely over the dusty fairgrounds as a ragtag crowd gathered around the makeshift ring, voices mingling in a low, restless hum. A battered wooden podium stood at the center, bearing the weight of the auctioneer who called out for bids in a hoarse, raspy tone. All around, an array of horses shifted uneasily in cramped pens, their eyes wide with apprehension. Ranchers, traders, and onlookers inspected the animals with both practiced expertise and casual indifference. Whispers about bloodlines and training murmured through the air, punctuated by bursts of laughter whenever a scrawny or unkempt creature appeared. But then came a hush, a ripple of curiosity spreading through the throng like a gust of wind. An unexpected figure stepped forward, drawing every gaze. He was old, with a long, tangled beard that matched his unruly grey hair. His clothes hung loose on his wiry frame, and his boots were caked in mud. There was little doubt he was a man of meager means. A few children giggled, pointing at his threadbare jacket, while one stout rancher in a pristine hat and polished belt buckle sneered openly. "Look at that old beggar," the rancher said. "Probably got nothing but pennies to spend." The old man's name was Gideon, though few in the crowd knew or cared to ask. He moved with a peculiar calmness, as though the jeers and snickers around him were merely rustling leaves in the wind. His gaze swept over the horses in the pens, lingering not on the youngest or glossiest, but rather on those that looked neglected or wary. There was a gentleness in his expression, a quiet empathy that went unnoticed by those whose eyes were blinded by appearances. Every so often, a fresh wave of laughter arose whenever Gideon paused before an especially bedraggled horse, as if to say, "How foolish can this old man be?" Before long, the auctioneer cleared his throat, trying to recapture the crowd's attention. "Lot 32, he announced, gesturing toward a pen at the edge of the ring. Inside stood a tall, dark horse, ribs showing through a rough, dull coat. Its eyes flickered with something akin to distrust. The animal's tail swished anxiously against bony flanks, and the spectators snorted with derision. "That bag of bones can't be worth $50," someone scoffed. Yet Gideon's weathered face remained unreadable. He took a step closer, ignoring the eyes that rolled in disdain. The auctioneer, an older fellow in a sweat-stained shirt, lifted his gavel high and tried to muster enthusiasm. "A fine horse, just needs a bit of feed and care," he exclaimed, his voice nearly cracking, but few seemed convinced. Muttered remarks about wasted time wafted from the crowd. The bidding opened at a modest sum, yet even that felt too generous for an animal in such condition. One by one, prospective buyers shook their heads. Some turned away outright, focusing instead on the next stallion or mare that might fetch a decent resale price. Only Gideon stood rooted to the spot, stroking his beard as he studied the horse with a discerning eye. "Going once, going twice," the auctioneer began, but was interrupted by Gideon's quiet voice. "I'll bid," he said simply. Heads whipped around in unison, as though the old man's words were a thunderclap. Snickers bubbled up from a knot of ranch hands near the fence. "He must be mad," one whispered. Another called out, "Better check your pockets, old man, or you might come up short." Gideon neither flinched nor replied. Instead, he raised his calloused hand higher. The auctioneer blinked, uncertain if this was a genuine offer. A hush fell over the gathering. For a moment, nobody spoke. Then a young woman in a faded sundress stepped forward, curiosity burning in her eyes. "Is that all?" she asked gently. "Just one bid," Her words seemed to echo a deeper sentiment, as though she questioned why no one else recognized any value in that forlorn creature. The rancher who had ridiculed Gideon earlier smirked. "One bid is all that horse deserves," he declared. But Gideon turned his gaze on the rancher, his eyes glinting like flint against stone. "I'll bid again if I must," Gideon said, his tone low but unyielding. The auctioneer glanced around, searching for any sign of a competing offer, yet the onlookers merely shifted in place, some stifling yawns, others watching Gideon as if waiting for him to embarrass himself. The horse, as if sensing the tension, let out a soft, uneasy nicker. At last, the rancher tossed his head. "Fine," he spat. "I'll play along." "One more dollar than the old man?" The crowd erupted in laughter and applause, treating the exchange like a spectacle. Gideon exhaled slowly, then raised his hand again, surpassing the rancher's pittance with calm assurance. A ripple of whispers moved through the bystanders, who began to suspect that the old man might not be so powerless after all. What followed was a tense standoff. The rancher and Gideon volleyed bids back and forth, each new offer poking holes in the assumption that this horse was worthless. Eyes darted from the horse to the two men locked in silent combat. With each incremental raise, the rancher's sneer deepened, his pride clearly stung by the idea that someone he deemed beneath him would dare outbid him. Gideon, for his part, remained composed, though a bead of sweat traced down his temple. He was no wealthy gentleman, and each extra dollar he pledged threatened to empty whatever meager reserves he had. Yet he pressed on. The auctioneer's voice quavered with mounting excitement. "We have a new offer. Do I hear any more?" he called, scanning the throng. The rancher paused, gripping his belt buckle so tightly his knuckles turned white. Finally, he let out a derisive snort. "I'm done wasting my money," he declared. "That horse will probably drop dead by sundown anyway." A wave of subdued chuckles fluttered through the crowd. Then the auctioneer, seizing the moment, raised his gavel. "Going once, going twice, sold to the gentleman with the beard." The word gentleman seemed almost sarcastic to some, but Gideon stood firm, stepping forward to seal the deal as all eyes bore into him. Gideon handed over his payment, crumpled bills and coins that had likely taken years to save. The auctioneer counted them with a mixture of surprise and curiosity before nodding his approval. With a weary smile, Gideon accepted the frayed lead rope. The horse threw its head up, muscles quivering as though expecting another round of mistreatment. Yet Gideon moved gently, his gnarled hand reaching out in a gesture of calm reassurance. "Easy there," he murmured, his voice hardly more than a breath. The horse's ears twitched, and its rolling eyes settled on Gideon's face. The crowd watched, transfixed by that unlikely exchange. An elderly woman in the back wiped her eyes, touched by the tenderness in Gideon's approach. A group of teenage stable boys whispered among themselves, casting uncertain glances at the pair. Even the rancher, though defeated, hovered nearby, arms folded, as if waiting for the slightest mishap to justify his scorn. "You'll regret this," he finally muttered, tipping his hat before striding off. Gideon remained silent, his attention on the trembling horse. Carefully, he led it away from the pens, away from prying eyes. With each step, the hush that had fallen over the fairgrounds began to lift, replaced by murmurs of disbelief. Some scoffed at the spectacle, while others felt a strange stirring in their chests, as though witnessing the opening lines of a tale they could not yet grasp. Once they reached a quieter corner of the fairgrounds, Gideon paused to assess his new companion. The horse's sides heaved with each ragged breath, and up close, its condition appeared even worse than it had in the ring. Ribs formed a ridged map beneath the dull coat, and faint scars ran along its flanks. Yet underneath the grime, Gideon sensed a spark of resilience. He saw it in the horse's dark, guarded eyes, a flicker that suggested a spirit not entirely broken. He remembered the stifled laughter and sharp words from the onlookers, as well as the rancher's mocking bid. None of that mattered anymore. What mattered was this trembling creature before him, and the promise Gideon had made to himself ages ago, after he'd spent a lifetime on the fringes of acceptance. He knew what it was like to be dismissed at a glance, so he vowed never to abandon anything or anyone simply because they seemed unremarkable. Often, what others deemed unworthy had hidden reserves of strength, waiting for a gentle hand to reveal them. Gently, Gideon nudged the horse forward. They wove through the bustling lanes where vendors hawked roasted nuts and polished saddles, past curious passers-by who either pointed or stared. Some recognized Gideon from the intense bidding war and eyed him with pity or mild amusement, convinced they were seeing a fool's errand. Still, he pressed on, determined to prove them wrong, not out of pride, but for the horse that now depended on him. As the sun began to dip, its golden rays stretched across the ground in long shadows. If Gideon felt any flicker of doubt, it did not show in his measured steps or the set of his shoulders. In his heart, he was already mapping out the feed, the rest, and the quiet patience that would restore life to a horse everyone else had given up on. At last, as evening fell, Gideon guided the horse to a small corral behind a dilapidated barn he'd managed to rent with his dwindling savings. He removed the rough halter, letting the horse roam free within the enclosure's battered fences. With a final gentle pat, Gideon whispered, "We'll show them what we're made of, old boy." The horse stood quietly, as though clinging to the promise in Gideon's voice. And so, under the deepening twilight, the echoes of scorn began to fade into memory, marking the start of an alliance that would soon ripple far beyond those dusty fairgrounds. That first night, Gideon rummaged through the dilapidated barn to gather whatever meager supplies he could find. A few flakes of old hay were stacked in a corner, dusty and far from the fresh timothy or alfalfa a healthier horse might enjoy. Still, he spread them gently on the ground of the small corral and waited, watching the dark silhouette that stood uncertainly against the moonlit sky. The horse, skittish and exhausted, kept its distance. Its sides still heaved from the day's events, and in the quiet hush of the evening, Gideon could almost hear the creature's trembling heartbeat. Wiping sweat and dirt from his brow, Gideon crouched near the fence and extended a piece of stale bread he had tucked away. It wasn't much, but it might coax the animal closer, might remind it that a human hand could offer compassion rather than cruelty. At first, the horse sniffed the air, ears swiveling as though it couldn't decide whether to bolt or edge forward. Gideon held steady, murmuring a soft reassurance that no one else would have bothered to give. When the horse finally took a tentative step, the old man found a fleeting smile. Soon enough, the weary animal gave in, stretching its muzzle to snatch the morsel from Gideon's fingers. Crumbs fell to the dirt, but it was enough to mark a truce between them. Gideon's mind drifted back to the auction, to the mocking eyes of that well-dressed rancher who had driven the bid higher out of sheer spite. He recalled the murmurs that rippled through the crowd, the quiet shock when Gideon had not backed down. Yet he felt no triumph in that memory, only relief that he had managed to secure the horse. Any sense of victory was tempered by the sight of the creature's gaunt flanks and the knowledge that healing it would be a slow, uncertain process. As the moon rose higher, casting pale light over the barn, Gideon pulled an old blanket from his belongings. His knees cracked as he stood, crossing the corral to lay the blanket over the horse's back. He kept his movements calm, voice soft. "Easy now," he whispered, his breath swirling in the cool night air. The horse flinched but did not recoil, its ears flicking at the unexpected warmth. Gideon sensed an unspoken question in the horse's eyes, something along the lines of, "Why are you doing this?" Though of course it made no sound. He had never named the beast, but as he patted its neck, he resolved to wait until the right name came to him. By morning, Gideon's bones felt stiff from having slept propped against a bale of straw. Still, he rose without complaint, pushing the barn door open to let in a stream of soft dawn light. The horse stood at the far side of the corral, head lowered but more at ease than the night before. Nearby, a battered trough sat empty. Gideon trudged to the well behind the barn, wincing as the rope burned his palms, but determined to draw up a fresh bucket. Carefully, he filled the trough until water lapped at the edges. The horse ambled over, thirst winning out over caution, and Gideon smiled to see it drink. As midday approached, a battered truck rattled down the dirt path leading to Gideon's rented patch of land. The driver was a middle-aged woman named Esther, a friend of sorts who ran a modest supply shop in town. She hopped out, straw hat askew, and waved in greeting. "Heard you got yourself a horse," she called, her gaze settling curiously on the dark figure in the corral. Gideon nodded, hooking his thumbs into his threadbare suspenders. "Aye," he replied. "Picked him up at the auction. Figured I'd try to mend him if I could." Esther's eyes widened, and she stepped closer to study the horse with a mix of concern and admiration. "He's in rough shape, Gideon," she remarked, shaking her head. "But I've known you long enough to guess you won't quit." With that, she reached into the back of her truck and pulled out a small sack of feed. "This isn't top grade," she apologized, handing it over, "but it'll keep him going until you can afford better." Gratitude welled in Gideon's chest, and he accepted the bag with a quiet, heartfelt thanks. Inside, the horse watched them, ears pricked, perhaps sensing a shift in its fortunes. Over the next few days, Gideon dedicated himself to the horse's care. Mornings began with clumsy tries at grooming, brushing away the caked mud and tangles in its mane. The horse stood rigid at first, every muscle poised to flee, but Gideon's patient hands never hurried or jerked. Inch by inch, he smoothed the coarse hair, revealing patches of underfed rib. He poured liniment on old scars, wondering how many nights of suffering those marks represented. At times, the horse shuddered as if recalling a cruel memory. Gideon kept his voice steady, hoping that even a frail kindness might eclipse the old wounds. Every so often, visitors appeared unannounced. Some were curious neighbors, drifting by under the pretext of offering leftover hay or a spare blanket, only to stand gawking at the spectacle of a broken-down horse and the odd old man who had bet all he had on it. Others brought hushed disbelief or half-hidden pity, shaking their heads as though Gideon had taken leave of his senses. "What do you plan to do with him?" asked one man, eyeing the horse skeptically. Gideon merely shrugged. "Plan to let him live," he answered, simple and true. Late one afternoon, a black pickup pulled up along the fence, its polished exterior glinting in the sun. Out stepped the same rancher who had sparred with Gideon at the auction. His hat was still pristine, and his boots looked as though they'd never touched honest dirt. He strode over, taking in the horse with a dismissive curl of his lip. "He's still on his feet?" the rancher inquired, feigning polite interest. Gideon nodded, offering no further comment. His companion gave a short laugh. "I've seen many animals come through that auction, old man. Most like this end up as feed." The words hung in the hot afternoon air, unkind and heavy. Gideon stared straight back, beard twitching with barely contained irritation. "And yet, he's still here," he replied. "Guess that means there's more to him than you thought." The rancher's cheeks colored slightly. He seemed on the verge of an angry retort, but held his tongue. Instead, he tossed a handful of crumpled bills onto the fence post. "If you change your mind," he said, voice dropping to a near whisper, "there's $50, more than he's worth. Just call me, and I'll haul him away." Then he tipped his hat and returned to the truck, leaving Gideon glaring at the dust cloud kicked up by the tires. Moments later, Gideon scooped up the money, strode to the corral, and handed the bills to the horse as if it could eat them. "You see this?" he asked, voice laced with contempt. The horse blinked, of course making no sense of the situation. "That's what he thinks you amount to," Gideon continued, letting the money fall to the dirt. He stood there, the horse at his side, sharing a quiet fury at the rancher's arrogance. In that moment, Gideon felt the last shred of doubt dissolve. He would do everything in his power to help this horse, to prove that it could stand tall against anyone's dismissive scorn. The following morning, as the sun cast long beams over the paddock, Gideon decided it was time for a name. Naming a creature was no small task, and he reflected on the horse's hard road. He thought about the cruelty it had endured, the mocking laughter, and the battered remains of its hope. Something about the way it held its head, even in weakness, reminded him of resilience, of an inner fire that refused to be snuffed out. Finally, he leaned against the corral fence, gazing into the horse's dark eyes. "Valor," he whispered, "that's who you are, Valor." The horse flicked its ear at the sound, as though testing the syllables. Gideon repeated the name, rolling it gently on his tongue. "Valor," he said again, stepping forward with the feed bucket. Now that he had named it, he felt an even deeper sense of kinship. Day by day, Valor began to respond to the old man's quiet care. The horse's ribs, still prominent, gained a faint covering of flesh. Dull hair shed to reveal a slightly shinier coat, and though every movement was cautious, there was a noticeable shift in Valor's demeanor. One afternoon, Gideon decided to let Valor out of the corral for a short walk around the property. He fastened a tattered rope halter around the horse's head, speaking in soothing tones whenever Valor jerked back or tossed its mane in alarm. Step by step, they ventured into the open field behind the barn, where wild grass rose to their knees. The breeze carried the scent of dust and sunlight, and for an instant, Valor lifted his muzzle to take in the unfamiliar freedom. Gideon halted, allowing him to graze. Watching the horse nibble on the sparse grass, Gideon felt the knot in his chest loosen. This was the beginning of something he hoped would blossom into a real life for Valor. Returning to the barn, Gideon noticed a figure standing by the fence. It was Esther again, holding a small canvas sack in one hand. She greeted him with a warm smile. "Got you a little something," she said, passing him the sack. Inside were better grooming tools and a few more feed supplements. "Word is, traveling," she added, eyes shining with encouragement. "Folks say you've gone soft in the head, but they're also curious, maybe even rooting for you." Gideon let out a breath, his lips curving in a rare grin. "Then let them watch," he answered. "Let them see what Valor can become." He spoke the name proudly, as though giving voice to the horse's emerging spirit. Esther nodded, her own excitement tempered with caution. "Just make sure you don't wear yourself too thin," she warned. "It's no secret you're on a tight budget. This could get pricey." Yet Gideon merely shrugged, turning to stroke Valor's neck. "I'll manage," he said. "Somehow, I'll manage." In the weeks that followed, Gideon and Valor fell into a daily rhythm that neither would have predicted from the bleak beginnings at the auction. Every morning, at the break of dawn, Gideon would shuffle out of the barn where he slept on a makeshift cot, his joints creaking in protest. Valor always lifted his head the moment Gideon appeared, ears pricked forward in a silent greeting. From there, Gideon's first order of business was to haul water from the well, an aching task for a man with tired bones, yet one he undertook without complaint. Once the trough was filled, he poured a modest scoop of feed into a battered bucket, careful not to overwhelm the horse's still delicate system. He had no illusions about Valor's condition. The horse remained underweight, and scars still traced lines across his hide. But with each day, there was a glimmer of progress, a more alert posture, a subtle shine in his coat. and a growing curiosity that sometimes had Valor stretching his neck over the fence to peer at passing clouds. Grooming became a ritual, one that Gideon approached with the solemnity of prayer. Armed with the brushes Esther had given him, he worked in firm but gentle strokes to dislodge clumps of dirt and dead hair. Valor would blink, shifting his weight from one hoof to the other as Gideon's hands coaxed away months, perhaps years, of grime. Occasionally, Gideon found new scrapes or signs of old infections that had never healed properly. He treated them with ointments he'd begged, borrowed or bartered for, all the while whispering soothing words as if incantations could scare off lingering ghosts. Through these slow, methodical sessions, Gideon sensed Valor growing more at ease. The horse's tension, rooted in memories of rough handling, began to loosen, replaced by cautious acceptance. Despite the progress, setbacks inevitably arose, sometimes a sharp noise, like a door slamming or a sudden gust that rattled the barn roof, would send Valor scrambling to the far corner of his pen, eyes wild with panic. Gideon learned not to chase after him but to stand still, speaking quietly until the horse's breath steadied. When that happened, Gideon would inch closer, letting Valor decide whether to approach. More often than not, Valor eventually lowered his head and came within reach. These moments tested Gideon's patience and reminded him of the deep wounds that could not be brushed aside by mere routine. Some nights, Gideon lay awake in the barn, listening to the horse shift in the corral, praying that Valor's restless hooves would find solace rather than fear. The old man's finances grew tighter with every purchase of feed and medicine. Though Esther was generous, providing small discounts and sometimes tossing in freebies, Gideon knew he couldn't depend on goodwill alone. He sold what few possessions he had left of value: a worn pocket watch that had once belonged to his father, and a couple of antique tools he'd held onto from better days. He also began taking on odd jobs around town, mending fences or cleaning stables. Even though his back screamed with each shovelful of muck, he pressed on. Whenever exhaustion threatened to overwhelm him, he reminded himself of Valor's trusting eyes and the promise he'd made to see this through. People started talking, of course. A few folks admired Gideon's dedication, comparing it to old stories they'd heard of miraculous rescues or redemption arcs. Others rolled their eyes behind his back, convinced that spending time and money on a lost cause was foolish. Despite the chatter, Gideon carried on, determined that every small gain belonged to both him and Valor. The horse's timid spark of life felt precious, a hidden gem that Gideon was adamant the world would see in time. If the cost was hours of labor or a handful of sneers, so be it. By early autumn, a subtle shift had taken root. Valor's once skeletal frame began filling out. Thin muscles appeared along his shoulders, and his ribs no longer jutted so starkly beneath his dark coat. There was also a budding light in his eyes, a curiosity that led him to whinny softly whenever Gideon approached. Encouraged, Gideon decided it might be time to explore training exercises that could strengthen Valor's body and mind. He fashioned a simple long line from a rope Esther had donated. One crisp morning, he led Valor to a small paddock behind the barn where the ground was relatively even. Gathering the rope in his left hand, he spoke softly, "We'll do this slow, boy. Nothing to fear." At the slightest tension, Valor jerked his head, hooves dancing nervously in the dirt. Gideon loosened his grip, letting the rope slacken. Step by step, they began a patient dance. Gideon coaxed Valor into a gentle walk along the perimeter of the paddock, giving him space to move without feeling trapped. At first, the horse's nervous energy pulsed through the rope like static, but as the minutes ticked by, Valor settled into a rhythmic stride. Now and again, Gideon clicked his tongue to encourage a trot. Each time, Valor threw his head up as though expecting a harsh yank or sharp command. When none came, he relaxed, snorting in relief. As the session wore on, Esther dropped by to witness the progress. She leaned against the fence, eyes lit with wonder. "Never thought I'd see him looking so calm," she murmured. Gideon flashed a rare grin, focusing on Valor's movements. "He's got it in him," he replied. "He's just waiting for the world to notice." After a few more circuits, Gideon reined the horse to a halt and approached carefully. Valor stood, sides heaving, but in his eyes there was no terror, only curiosity. Gideon stroked his neck, pride swelling in his chest. "Good boy," he whispered. Esther clapped softly, a hint of awe in her applause. But even as Valor's physical condition improved, Gideon sensed the fragility of their arrangement. His limited funds drained away faster than he could replenish them. The barn's rent loomed on the horizon, and an early cold snap threatened to make the upcoming winter harsh. Gideon tried not to dwell on these worries when he worked with Valor, but in quieter moments, they gnawed at him. One evening, after scrubbing out the feed buckets and ensuring Valor had fresh bedding, Gideon slumped on his cot, exhaustion pressing on his eyelids. He wondered if a day might come when he would have to admit defeat, to concede that he couldn't provide for the horse's ongoing needs. That doubt weighed heavily on him the next morning when the polished black pickup reappeared. The rancher from the auction stepped out, wearing his usual immaculate hat and a smug expression. He leaned against the fence, observing Valor graze on sparse patches of grass. "Well, I'll be," he drawled. "Looks like you've done more for that nag than I expected." Gideon tensed, bracing for another snide remark. Sure enough, the rancher continued, "Course, I can see you're struggling. Maybe you ought to sell him off while he's in better shape, fetch a bit more than last time." Gideon gripped the fence rail, knuckles whitening. "He's not for sale," he declared, voice quiet but firm. The rancher let out a soft snort. "Everybody's got a price, old man." "Wouldn't blame you if you took the money and ran. Winter's coming, and feed doesn't grow on trees." Gideon didn't respond right away, his gaze pinned on Valor. After a tense silence, the rancher shrugged. "Suit yourself," he said, turning to walk back to his truck. "When it all falls apart, don't say I didn't warn you." The engine roared to life, and in seconds, the truck was gone, leaving a haze of settling dust in its wake. Alone once more, Gideon let out a ragged sigh. He felt Valor's presence behind him, the warmth of the horse's breath on his shoulder. If the rancher's remarks were meant to unnerve him, they had succeeded. But as soon as Gideon's eyes met Valor's steady gaze, he felt a surge of protective resolve. The horse had seen enough betrayal. Gideon refused to be the next person to let him down. No matter how precarious their circumstances, giving up was not an option. Esther returned later that day with a small envelope in hand, cheeks flushed from the brisk autumn wind. Inside, Gideon found a modest donation collected by a handful of sympathetic townsfolk, some who had admired his grit, others who simply pitied his situation. It wasn't a fortune, but it was enough to buy more feed and stock up on blankets to brace for the dropping temperatures. Embarrassed by the gesture, Gideon nonetheless thanked Esther with uncharacteristic emotion. "This'll see us through a bit longer," he admitted, fiddling with the envelope. "I don't know what we'd do otherwise." The next morning dawned chillier, patches of frost glimmering on the grass. Gideon woke early, wincing at the stiffness in his back. He found Valor standing alert in the corral, nostrils flaring as he breathed puffs of steam into the cold air. The old man chuckled, stepping closer to rub the horse's muzzle. "Getting cooler, isn't it?" he said, as though making casual conversation with an old friend. Valor nudged Gideon's shoulder, perhaps in search of a treat, or perhaps simply acknowledging the bond that had grown between them. That small gesture felt like a victory against the looming hardships. Around midday, a traveling farrier arrived, a stooped, muscular fellow named Luis. Esther had mentioned that Gideon's horse might need proper hoof care, and Luis had offered a reduced rate. Peering at Vala's hooves, Luis grunted in disapproval. "Not the worst I've seen, but close," he said. "These cracks go deep. We'll have to trim, file, maybe fit him for shoes eventually." Gideon winced at the mention of cost, but forced a nod. He held Vala's head, murmuring soft reassurances as Luis worked. Though Vala tensed at each unfamiliar tug and scrape, the farrier's gentle approach minimized panic. By the end, Vala stood with steadier footing, though a trace of anxiety still lingered in his eyes. When Luis departed, Gideon found himself alone once more with his horse and his thoughts. Every act of kindness chipped away at his pride. Relying on discounts, donations, and charitable hands made him feel uneasy. Yet each day, Vala offered silent proof that it was all worth it. That night, as Gideon settled onto his cot, he closed his eyes and conjured an image of the future. Vala standing strong in a field of tall grass, galloping without fear, his once starved body gleaming in good health. In that vision, Gideon was free of worries about feed bills or biting cold. Perhaps it was a fantasy, but he let it fill him with hope. Outside, Vala shifted in the corral, hooves crunching softly over straw, and Gideon drifted off with the comforting knowledge that every step forward, however small, was a testament to what unwavering faith and patient care could achieve. Winter's approach was no mere rumor. Every dawn arrived chillier than the last, and the wind carried a warning of early snow. Gideon rose each morning to find frost clinging to the fence rails, turning the corral into a slippery mosaic of ice. Even Vala, usually alert at the sound of the barn door creaking open, seemed subdued. The old man, bundled in layers of mismatched clothing, took special care to warm the water bucket before hauling it outside. Despite the season's difficulties, Gideon refused to yield. He tightened a patchwork blanket around Vala each night, offering whispered reassurances that they'd survive the looming cold together. In truth, a small flame of anxiety burned in Gideon's heart. Supplies were modest, and money was scarce. But as he watched Vala watch him, he knew giving up was unthinkable. One afternoon, after hammering loose boards back into place along the barn wall, Gideon paused to catch his breath. His limbs ached, and his fingers felt numb beneath his worn gloves. He'd heard rumors that the rancher who wanted to buy Vala might return with a bigger offer, spurred on by gossip that the horse looked noticeably stronger. Gideon steeled himself for that possibility. He had no intention of selling. Vala was more than a commodity. Each day spent side by side, mending wounds both visible and hidden, reminded Gideon that the horse's worth was immeasurable. Besides, he doubted any sum of money could fill the hollowness he'd feel if he gave up on Vala. So he pushed the thought away, vowing to guard his companion from those who saw only profit. True to that resolve, Gideon soon found himself taking longer walks with Vala in the pasture behind the barn, forging an unspoken trust through gentle routines. Sometimes he simply stood beside the horse while Vala grazed, letting the hush of the landscape envelop them. Other times, he guided Vala through simple exercises with a rope halter, coaxing him to turn, halt, and follow subtle cues. Each session showed the horse's growing confidence. No longer did Vala flinch at every rustle of leaves or quick movement from Gideon's hand. Instead, a wary acceptance had begun to blossom into genuine security. In those moments, Gideon felt a quiet pride that transcended any worldly measure. He might be old and poor, but he was here witnessing the transformation of a creature once deemed worthless. One chilly morning, Esther stopped by with a bundle of woolen blankets and an invitation. She explained that a local farmer was hosting a small horse fair before the snow set in, an informal gathering of neighbors where animals could be sold, traded, or simply showcased. Esther had secured Gideon a spot if he wanted to present valor. At first, Gideon bristled. The memory of the auction still stung, along with the feeling that public events invited only scorn. But Esther insisted it could be a chance to show people how far valor had come. Maybe, she reasoned, they'd finally understand that a horse's worth wasn't confined to outward beauty or breeding. Gideon hesitated, old doubts flooding his mind, yet a seed of hope took root. Perhaps letting others see valor's transformation could inspire more kindness. In the end, Gideon agreed. The following week, with the morning sky clear but biting cold, he loaded valor onto a borrowed trailer. The horse trembled as the metal ramp clanked beneath his hooves, but Gideon's soothing voice guided him inside. By the time they reached the fairgrounds, a humble stretch of field lined with canvas tents, valor's breath formed pale clouds in the icy air. Gideon coaxed him out. The older man's back aching from the cramped ride, he led valor through a maze of stalls selling tack, feed, and homemade crafts. Curious glances followed them, but Gideon couldn't tell if they were mocking or admiring. He simply focused on keeping valor calm, gently stroking the horse's shoulder whenever he sensed a surge of nervous energy. At last, they arrived at the modest ring where a handful of other horses were on display. Most were sleek, well-groomed animals, whose owners wore polished boots and confident smiles. Gideon stood in stark contrast, his threadbare coat and scuffed shoes declaring his poverty to anyone who cared to notice. Still, when he looked at valor, he saw undeniable progress. The horse's coat, though not lustrous, no longer looked neglected, and the dullness in his eyes had given way to alertness. Feeling a tremor of nerves himself, Gideon tethered valor near a trough and offered him a light snack of hay. He could sense the judgments forming in people's minds as they compared his ragtag appearance to the fancy gear of the others. Even so, Gideon's resolve held firm. During a lull in the festivities, a portly announcer with a clipboard ambled over, inviting each horse owner to step forward and describe their animal's breed and background. Gideon swallowed hard, recalling how little he actually knew about valor's lineage. The horse came from a place of misfortune, that much was clear, but Gideon had no papers, no fancy lineage to flaunt. When his turn arrived, he cleared his throat, feeling every eye settle on his weathered face. In a quiet voice, he explained that valor had once been dismissed at auction, labeled useless and unworthy, but now stood as proof of what kindness and perseverance could accomplish. His words, though unpolished, carried a humble sincerity. A hush fell over the small crowd, and for a moment Gideon felt a flicker of acceptance, but acceptance often stands on shaky ground. As the announcer moved on, Gideon overheard hushed comments drifting through the air. Some folks admired his effort, remarking that valor looked far better than expected. Others snickered behind raised hands, calling the horse a charity project. Still, Gideon refused to let the snide remarks overshadow the genuine interest he observed in a few kinder faces. He busied himself checking valor's halter and offering sips of water. The horse remained calm, occasionally flicking his ears at the unfamiliar music or laughter that bubbled from nearby stalls. Gideon reminded himself this wasn't a competition. It was a chance for valor to step into the world without shame. Even if the world remained skeptical, at least valor would sense that he deserved a place here. Suddenly, a familiar voice sliced through the fair's gentle buzz. Gideon turned to see the rancher approaching, his fine hat perched at a jaunty angle. A tightness settled in Gideon's chest, but he kept his composure. The rancher glanced at Valor, eyebrows raised in mild surprise. "I'll be damned," he muttered. "Didn't expect him to clean up this well." Gideon said nothing, bracing for whatever barb might come next. Instead, the rancher reached out and ran a gloved hand along Valor's neck, appraising. "He's still not a prize winner," the man declared, "but he's got more life than I gave him credit for." The rancher then looked Gideon square in the eye. "I'll up my offer, old man." 300 now. A faint hush rippled outward, with onlookers craning to hear Gideon's response. Gideon drew a steady breath. He remembered the rancher's mocking laughter at the auction, the cruel sneers and the assumption that an old man lacked the backbone to fight back. Slowly, Gideon shook his head. "I won't sell him," he said, voice unwavering. "Valor's not a figure on a check. He's a living soul, and he's come too far to be bartered again." The rancher opened his mouth, but Gideon continued before he could speak. "If you can't see that, then no amount of money matters to me." A hush fell, sharper and more profound this time. With an emphatic calm, Gideon turned away, guiding Valor aside. In that resolute gesture, he silenced every final doubt and every jeer. A hush deeper than anything before blanketed the fair's ring, as if every breath had been snatched from the air. Gideon felt the rancher's eyes on his back, but he chose not to turn around. Instead, he reached up to stroke Valor's neck, a tangible reminder of everything they had overcome. The crowd seemed torn between admiration and confusion, each gaze drifting from the old man's threadbare coat to the sturdy but still imperfect horse at his side. For a moment, the fair's bustle quieted, and in that fleeting stillness, Gideon felt relief wash over him. It wasn't victory he felt, but a vindication of sorts, a sense that no matter what obstacles remained, the connection he shared with Valor rose above ridicule. When the announcer resumed his patter, Gideon exhaled slowly, ready for whatever happened next. As the day wore on, people drifted by Valor's stall, some more curious than others. A wiry man in dusty chaps asked if Gideon had plans to train Valor for ranch work, while a mother and her young daughter simply marveled at how gentle he seemed. Esther swung by with a relieved grin, praising Gideon for standing his ground. Still, the rancher's parting words echoed in Gideon's mind, a reminder that survival would be no easy feat. Winter was coming fast. A swirl of cold wind rattled the loose canvas overhead, and Gideon tugged his coat tighter. He knew they couldn't stay at the fair forever. Soon, he and Valor would have to return home to the uncertain reality of meager supplies and a drafty barn. By mid-afternoon, Gideon packed up his sparse belongings, guided Valor into the trailer, and set off along the winding country road. The sky overhead glowed a dull gray, hinting at impending snowfall. The trailer rattled with every bump, and Gideon drove slower than usual, wary of icy patches. His thoughts roamed to the cost of hay, the cracks in the barn roof, and the lumps of straw he'd have to scrounge up for bedding. Even so, a faint spark of satisfaction warmed him. Though the rancher's offer had been easy money, Gideon had stood his ground. He felt he owed that to Valor, a creature once stripped of dignity and safety. Perhaps refusing the deal put them at greater risk, but Gideon believed that some risks were worth taking. They arrived home as twilight blurred the horizon. Gideon parked the trailer behind the barn, then led Valor out, pausing to check the horse's legs for any soreness. Satisfied, he patted Valor's flank and guided him into the corral. A biting wind swept across the yard, turning Gideon's breath into frosty plumes. Inside the barn, the air felt marginally warmer, though every gust found cracks to slip through. By the glow of a single lantern, Gideon spread fresh straw and refilled the feed bucket. Valor nudged his arm as if to thank him, then lowered his head to eat. Outside, the wind's howl intensified, yet Gideon took a moment to appreciate the small contentment in Valor's eyes. In that quiet barn, adversity seemed momentarily distant. The next morning brought the season's first snowfall. Thin flakes drifted onto the corral, dusting every surface in pale white. Valor stood at the fence line, ears pricked in cautious wonder, his breath creating faint clouds around his muzzle. Gideon watched from the barn door, clutching an old coat around himself. He worried about the horse's thin coat and the trouble he'd have maintaining warmth. After a quick breakfast of stale biscuits, Gideon busied himself hanging extra blankets around Valor's stall, stuffing gaps in the barn walls with rags to keep out drafts. Though his hands shook from cold and fatigue, he pressed on. It wasn't a perfect solution, but it would have to suffice until he could scrape together enough to buy better insulation. As the snow deepened, Gideon noticed changes in Valor's behavior. Freed from the constant fear that once gripped him, the horse displayed a playful streak, occasionally kicking up fresh powder or nuzzling Gideon's pockets for treats. They continued short training sessions whenever the weather allowed. Gideon led Valor in circles around the corral, navigating slippery patches with care. Each day, Valor's strides grew steadier, and a confidence shimmered in his eyes. Neighbors who chanced upon the scene sometimes stopped to watch, drawn by the improbable sight of an old man and a once broken horse forging an unlikely partnership in the bleak winter landscape. Though Gideon was never one for boasting, he took quiet pride in the transformation unfolding before him, yet the financial strain tightened like a vice. With each trip to the feed store, Gideon felt the sting of dwindling funds. He spent his evenings mending tack for local ranchers or doing small repairs in exchange for a few dollars. On particularly frigid nights, he wondered if he should have taken the ranchers' money, if only to spare Valor from the hardships. But every time the thought arose, Gideon remembered the softness in Valor's gaze when the horse rested his head against his shoulder. That moment of connection was priceless, overshadowing any sum that might threaten to tear them apart. Somehow, Gideon scraped by, trusting that the path he had chosen, though steep and uncertain, was the only one worth walking. In the thick of December, a ferocious storm hit. Snow fell in relentless sheets, burying fences and turning roads into perilous trails. Gideon huddled in the barn, lantern light flickering against the rough-hewn walls. Valor stood near him, trembling more from the howling wind than from the cold itself, or so Gideon hoped. He draped the horse in multiple blankets and checked repeatedly to be sure no drifting snow had blown in through cracks. Night stretched long and dark, and Gideon dozed fitfully on a straw bale, waking every so often to the stallion's restless shifts. Outside, the wind screeched, but each time Gideon stirred, he offered a soft murmur of reassurance. If Valor took comfort in his presence, Gideon considered that a victory. By dawn, the storm had subsided, though heavy drifts blocked the barn entrance. Gideon cleared a narrow path, inching forward with a shovel that felt too large for his tired arms. Icicles hung from the eaves, and the corral's gate was frozen shut. When he finally broke through the ice and ventured outside, he found that the wooden fence behind the barn had collapsed under the weight of the snow. A surge of dismay gripped him, imagining how much effort and expense would go into repairs. Yet as the morning light spilled over Valor, revealing the horse standing tall despite the cold, Gideon's resolve solidified. If the fence needed mending, he'd mend it. If more feed was required, he'd find a way. Giving up was never an option. Later that evening, Gideon stood outside with Valor, both of them gazing at the quiet sky. Stars glittered fiercely in the frigid air, and the moon's glow revealed the stark white blanket covering the fields. His breath caught in his throat when he realized how far they had come since the day he first spotted Valor at the auction. Though the road ahead was uncertain, Gideon found solace in the horses' steady companionship and the simple routines that kept them alive. He thought of that moment in the fair's ring, when he'd turned his back on the rancher's offer. Valor had not been for sale then, and he never would be. In this winter night, Gideon swore anew to stand by Valor's side, no matter the trials yet to come. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote howled, echoing across frozen fields. Tomorrow would be another day of labor, a chance to prove hope could triumph over doubt. In that moment, Gideon drew strength, trusting they would never face winter alone. The dawn after that fierce storm found Gideon carefully navigating the ice-encrusted path between the barn and the corral, shoulders bent against the biting cold. Snowdrifts glimmered under a sky washed pale by the frigid morning light. He had spent the better part of the night awake, checking on Valor whenever howling winds rattled the barn walls. Now, however, the storm lay in the past, and a brittle calm wrapped the landscape. With each cautious step, Gideon's worn boots crunched through a layer of refrozen sleet, sending faint echoes across the silent yard. At the corral, he discovered Valor peering over a battered fence rail, ears tilted toward him in what Gideon liked to imagine was a greeting. The horse's breath bloomed in white puffs that swirled upward before vanishing into the chilled air. Gideon paused to take in the sight. Just a few months ago, Valor had stood forlorn and half-starved, barely able to hold his head up. Now, despite the stinging wind, the horse's eyes shone with alertness, and his coat, though still rough in places, carried a quiet gleam in the morning sun. Gideon felt a familiar welling of pride and relief. Even in these harsh winter conditions, Valor's transformation offered hope. After hauling a fresh bucket of lukewarm water, heated by a small fire he'd kindled before dawn, Gideon stepped into the corral. His breath came out in trembling gasps, and a jolt of pain flared in his back whenever he bent to lift the bucket. Yet the old man mustered a smile as Valor snorted a greeting and took a tentative sip. "Ain't so bad today, is it?" Gideon murmured, rubbing the horse's forehead with a gloved hand. The horse blinked slowly, as though acknowledging Gideon's efforts to banish the chill. Once Valor was watered and fed, Gideon returned to the barn, searching for salvageable scraps of wood to mend the broken fence behind the structure. A portion had collapsed under the storm's weight, leaving a gap that critters, or worse, a panicked horse, could slip through. The meager pile of planks he'd collected over the autumn now seemed laughably insufficient. Still, he refused to let despair take hold. With careful measurement and a few nails he'd bartered from a neighbor, Gideon pieced together a rough replacement. Every hammer blow jarred his stiff joints, yet determination fueled him. By midday, the patchwork fence stood upright again, a shaky barrier against the elements. It was far from perfect, but it would have to do. Later that week, a traveling veterinarian named Morris arrived. Esther had mentioned Valor's ongoing recovery, and Morris volunteered to pay a visit since he was passing through with other farm calls. Gideon felt a twinge of anxiety at the idea of professional scrutiny. He recalled too many dismissive voices from the past, people who claimed Valor would never recover, that Gideon was throwing good money after bad. But Morris proved a gentle soul. He examined Valor's teeth, checked the horse's hooves, and listened to his heartbeat with a stethoscope that gleamed in the barn's dim light. When he finished, Morris stood back, nodding in cautious approval. "He's come a long way," he said, wiping his brow. "Still needs more weight and muscle, but you've done right by him." Gideon's throat felt tight with gratitude. "So, he'll be all right then," he ventured, not wanting to sound desperate. Morris offered a kind smile. "He's on the mend, and with steady care, I see no reason he can't thrive. Just be mindful this winter. Keep him warm, keep him fed, and watch for any signs of respiratory trouble. The cold can be unforgiving." Gideon nodded, storing each word like precious currency. Before leaving, Morris pressed a small bag of herbal supplements into Gideon's hands. "For his coat and digestion," the vet explained. "No charge." "Consider it my way of rooting for him." A pang of humility struck Gideon. So many people had helped along the way. Esther with her supplies, the farrier with his reduced-rate visits, and now Morris with his free herbs. Gideon felt a mix of relief and embarrassment each time he accepted assistance, recalling how fiercely he once clung to independence. But then he glanced at Valor and remembered that such pride had no place when a life depended on him. The old man swallowed his misgivings and thanked Morris, watching him depart in a rattling truck that kicked up clouds of powdery snow. Winter ground onward. The nights remained brutal, but Valor managed better than Gideon dared hope. They continued their routine of brief exercise sessions, sometimes indoors when Gideon could clear enough space in the barn's center aisle. The horse showed flashes of spirit now, a half-playful buck when the rope halter felt too constricting, or a sudden canter in the corral when the sun pierced through the overcast sky. Each display of energy made Gideon grin, though it also magnified the question simmering at the back of his mind. What next? Once the snow melted, could Valor take on more specialized training? Could they even dream of demonstrations or competitions, like the well-heeled owners who had once mocked them? Gideon wasn't sure. He had no illusions about grandeur, only a desire to see Valor fulfill whatever destiny lay ahead, free of the ghosts that once haunted him. The conversation about Valor's future surfaced one evening when Esther dropped by with a small crock of stew. The temperature had plunged well below freezing, and Gideon's meager stove burned with a precarious flame. Over steaming bowls, the two of them sat on upturned crates. "I've been thinking," Esther began, stirring her stew. "There's a spring fair in a few months, much bigger than the one we went to in the fall. Lots of folks come from across the region to show off their animals, race them, or even trade." She glanced at Valor, whose head poked inquisitively through a gap in the barn door. "He's growing stronger by the day. Maybe you could enter him, show people he's not just recovered, but remarkable." Gideon set his spoon aside, pondering the idea. A slight wariness tugged at him, stirring memories of the rancher's sneers and the crowd's scorn. "I'm not sure I want to parade him around like a trophy," he said at last. "He's been through enough." Esther gave a gentle shrug. "It's your choice. But think of it this way. A successful showing might change how folks see horses like him, animals thought worthless, but who only needed a chance. You might inspire others, Gideon. And maybe, if there's a small purse for winners, you could put that money toward the barn." She gestured at the roof beams, from which a draft of cold air slipped through. Silence stretched between them. Gideon studied the faint steam rising from his bowl. Could he do that? Did Valor truly have the potential to compete even in a modest event? He thought of the horse's half-remembered training needs, the limitations of Gideon's own aging body, and the uncertain demands of the months ahead. With a slow breath, he met Esther's gaze. "I'll think on it," he said simply. She nodded, understanding that no immediate answer was required. A few days later, Gideon rose before sunrise, spurred by a persistent nudge from Valor. The horse, evidently restless, pawed at the barn floor in anticipation of his morning routine. Gideon decided to walk him to the outer pasture, figuring the crisp air might do them both some good. Dawn light crept across the sky, revealing glistening icicles and glittering snowdrifts. Carrying a rope and a halter, Gideon led Valor along the path, stepping gingerly over hidden ice patches. Once they reached the open field, Valor snorted, ears flicking to catch distant sounds. A few crows cawed from a skeletal tree, and the hush of winter enveloped them. Gideon let out the rope so Valor could move more freely. The horse responded with a spirited trot, sending sprays of powdered snow into the air. Gideon watched, heart brimming with admiration. Despite the stumbling blocks, his own limited funds, the biting cold, and the memory of harsh voices, he couldn't deny that Valor had regained his essence. The horse's tail flicked, legs gathering beneath him in a graceful surge of momentum. For an instant, Gideon pictured the future Esther had hinted at, a fair in warmer weather. Onlookers marveling at the once rejected horse now full of life. Maybe, just maybe, it could happen. He let the moment unfold without interfering. Valor circled back, breath steaming, hooves stamping shallow impressions into the snow. Gideon approached slowly, offering a treat from his pocket. The horse lipped it up, ears swiveling in relaxed contentment. As Gideon stroked Valor's neck, a faint flush of possibility swept through him. Whether or not they attempted the fare, he resolved to continue refining the horse's training. Giving Valor a goal might further build his confidence, and if it came with a financial reward, that might keep the roof over both their heads. That afternoon, Gideon began taking notes in an old ledger he'd salvaged from a junk pile. He jotted down potential training exercises, feeding regimens, and any advice gleaned from Esther, the farrier, or Morris. The act of writing felt unfamiliar to his gnarled hands, but it gave him a semblance of organization. He reasoned that if Valor needed to perform tasks or movements, they'd start small, transitioning from a walk to a trot on command, practicing halts without tension, and navigating obstacles in the corral, none of it dramatic, but every success would remind them both how far they had come. Their first attempt at an obstacle course was laughably modest. Gideon set up low rails and a couple of hay bales in the barn's open space, then coaxed Valor through the tight corners. At times, the horse balked, wide-eyed, as if uncertain why these objects cluttered his path. But Gideon's patience prevailed. Step by step, Valor learned to navigate the challenges without panicking. Each time the horse cleared a small hurdle, Gideon offered praise in a quiet, steady tone. Gradually, Valor's movements gained surety, and a spark of curiosity replaced apprehension. Late in the evening, after they finished and the lantern's flame danced on the barn walls, Gideon smiled at the horse's quiet triumph. It wasn't a public stage, it wasn't a show ring, yet in that humble barn, the seeds of confidence were sown. Deep winter nights still tested Gideon's resolve. Often, the wind shrieked outside, and in the dim light of pre-dawn, he'd awaken stiff and cold. But each morning brought a renewed determination, fueled by the knowledge that Valor no longer stood alone in the world. Snow or sleet, old age or poverty, mockery or doubt, none of it could fully overshadow the promise that glowed in the horse's eyes. Sometimes Gideon felt that he drew his own strength from Valor, as though the horse's will to heal gave the old man another reason to persist. With the ledger of training notes tucked safely in his coat pocket, Gideon prepared for the next day's trials, heart set on unlocking whatever future awaited them. Though the snow still blanketed the fields, Gideon noticed the days growing fractionally longer. Each extra minute of daylight felt like a blessing, a promise that winter would eventually yield to spring. He poured his energy into Valor's training sessions, making daily notes of small triumphs, how calmly the horse stepped over a wooden pole, how swiftly he responded to Gideon's soft word of encouragement. In those moments, Gideon experienced the quiet elation of seeing a once broken spirit blossom. Yet behind that sense of accomplishment, he remained aware of the precarious balance they were keeping. Fodder supplies dwindled, repairs on the barn lagged, and Gideon's joints ached more fiercely than ever. One late morning, as Gideon was guiding Valor around the makeshift obstacle course in the barn, a knock sounded at the door. He froze, unsure who might visit at such an odd hour. Esther usually came by in the evenings, and the farrier or the vet gave notice before appearing. Carefully setting the rope aside, Gideon led Valor into a corner stall and opened the barn door a crack. To his surprise, a stranger stood outside, a young woman bundled in a heavy coat, her cheeks flushed with cold. She introduced herself as Lily, saying she'd heard whispers in town about a horse saved from ruin. Gideon felt a twinge of caution, but he let Lily step inside, out of the wind. She explained that she worked with a local rescue group hoping to feature stories of neglected animals that found new purpose. "I came to see if you'd be willing to share your journey with Valor," she said, glancing at the horse, who eyed her with wary curiosity from behind the stall door. At first, Gideon hesitated. Privacy had always been his shield against gossip. Yet the sincerity in Lily's voice and the memory of others' kindness weighed on him. Slowly, he nodded. "I'll do what I can to help," he murmured. Over the following days, Lily visited sporadically, carrying a small notebook in which she scrawled details about Gideon's work with Valor. She asked countless questions about the auction, about Valor's health, about Gideon's decision to keep him rather than profit from his sale. Though Gideon was never much for lengthy conversation, he found her presence strangely comforting. As he recounted the horse's transformation, he felt an echo of wonder at how far they had come. At night, Lily's words haunted him, stirring pride he tried to tamp down. He'd never sought attention, but if their story inspired mercy for animals like Valor, perhaps it was worth telling. The full force of winter held the region in its grip, and Gideon spent long nights tending the fire that kept Valor's water from freezing solid. Sometimes Lily helped, her hands red from the cold as she chopped kindling or held a lantern so Gideon could check for drafts. She never complained, even when the wind whipped snow flurries into her eyes, or when the barn door jammed with ice. Esther, too, lent support, bringing extra feed whenever her budget allowed. In turn, Gideon tried to accept these acts of kindness without feeling beholden. Pride warred with gratitude, but Valor's well-being mattered more than his reservations. One afternoon, Lily broached the subject of the spring fair that Esther had mentioned weeks before. "Have you thought about entering Valor?" she asked, taking notes as Gideon tacked up the horse for a brief training round. He shrugged, adjusting the makeshift saddle pad he'd fashioned from an old blanket. "I'm still not sure he's ready for any public show. Last time we did something like that, there were plenty of sneers." Lily tapped her pen thoughtfully. "But imagine if people saw him now, a strong, confident horse." "That might open their eyes," Gideon exhaled. "I suppose, but if we go, it's for him, not for applause." Outside, a pale sun glinted on the icy ground, reflecting off the patches where snow had begun to melt. Gideon led Valor in careful circles, practicing transitions from a slow walk to a brisk trot. Lily watched with rapt attention, scribbling notes and snapping a few photos. At first, Valor tossed his head at the unfamiliar click of her camera, but Gideon's calm voice and steady hand reassured him. The horse settled into a measured stride, ears swiveling forward. In that moment, Gideon realized he was no longer simply patching up a broken creature. He was training a partner, a being who trusted him enough to try. As the months of winter dragged on, Gideon's finances dipped perilously low. One day, he caught himself staring at the spare bridle and thinking of how much it might fetch if sold. But each time such thoughts crept in, he pushed them aside, remembering the rancher's taunts and the vow he'd made not to betray Valor's trust for convenience. He took on additional odd jobs, clearing snow from neighbors' driveways or fixing a broken fence for a local orchard. Most nights, he came home numb with fatigue, hands raw from the cold, but he pressed on. He had to. A living soul depended on him. Gradually, Lily's visits shaped into a plan. She proposed writing a small article for her rescue group's newsletter, featuring Gideon and Valor as a testament to second chances. While Gideon felt uneasy about the idea of public attention, Lily's earnestness and kindness won him over. She asked permission to photograph Valor's training sessions, and Gideon agreed. Under the barn's dim lights, she captured images of the horse stepping over rails or responding to gentle voice commands. Whenever Valor performed especially well, Gideon glimpsed tears in Lily's eyes. "People need to see what care and patience can achieve," she whispered, gently patting Valor's neck. One frigid evening, when the moon hung low over the frozen fields, Gideon finished his chores and found Lily waiting by the barn door. Her cheeks glowed with excitement despite the cold. "I've shown some drafts of your story around," she said, voice trembling slightly. "They want more than just a newsletter piece. They're considering a feature in a regional magazine that focuses on rescued and rehabilitated horses. It could bring in donations, or at least raise awareness for folks in need like you." Gideon felt his chest tighten. The thought of his humble life splashed across glossy pages made him uneasy, but Lily's eyes gleamed with hope. Before Gideon could respond, a scraping sound broke through the hush of the night. It came from the far side of the barn, where he stored feed in precarious stacks. Alarmed, Gideon grabbed a lantern and hurried over. In the gloom, he saw a thin crack in the barn's foundation had widened, letting snowmelt seep inside. Some bales had shifted dangerously, threatening to tumble. Lily rushed forward, attempting to help steady them, but the topmost bale teetered and toppled onto Gideon's leg. Pain flared hot and immediate as he stifled a gasp. Lily cried out, frantically hauling the bale aside, her face etched with alarm. Gideon braced himself against the wall, breathing through clenched teeth. The bale wasn't heavy enough to break bone, but it had landed hard, and his knee throbbed fiercely. Lily offered her shoulder, helping him limp toward the bench near Valor's stall. The horse stirred, sensing distress. "I'm fine," Gideon insisted, though sweat beaded on his brow. Carefully, Lily pulled up his pant leg to reveal swelling and bruising around the knee. "You need ice, or something cold at least," she muttered. In minutes, they managed to tie a small bag of snow in place. Gideon winced, but forced a reassuring nod. "I'll live, just a bruised pride." Nonetheless, the incident rattled them both. That night, Lily stayed late, ensuring Gideon's leg didn't worsen. Valor kept watch from his stall, occasionally nickering softly. With each pulse of pain, Gideon considered how precarious their situation remained. If he were laid up, who would care for Valor? Who would pay for feed or fix the barn's failing beams? Lily's mention of the magazine fluttered in his mind, a possibility that might lighten their burdens. After hours of restless deliberation, he met Lily's gaze and spoke haltingly. "Let's do it, the feature. Whatever it takes to keep Valor safe." Through a veil of relief, Lily smiled, and beyond the barn walls, dawn hinted at the promise of spring. By the time Gideon woke the next morning, the snowdrifts had softened under a rising sun, and the barn felt marginally less frigid. His knee throbbed, reminding him of the recent accident. He winced as he pushed aside the blanket and rose gingerly from his makeshift cot, testing his weight. Though the pain shot up his leg, he was determined not to let it sideline him. Outside, a pale blue sky suggested that winter's iron grip was loosening. Small rivulets of meltwater trickled across the barn's threshold. Gideon glanced at the stacked hay bales, newly rearranged to prevent another mishap. He told himself he'd just have to be more cautious. Vala peered over his stall door, ears tilting forward in greeting. Soft sunlight glinted off the horse's coat, highlighting the once bare patches, now hidden by healthy hair. Gideon hobbled over with a bucket of water warmed on the stove. The horse watched him closely, as if sensing his discomfort, and nudged his shoulder in a gentle gesture that almost felt like concern. Gideon patted Vala's neck, murmuring, "I'm fine, old friend. We'll manage." He poured the water into a trough by the stall. Despite everything, seeing Vala so bright-eyed filled him with renewed hope. Moments later, Lily arrived with a steaming cup of tea and a determined look. She insisted Gideon sit while she handled the morning chores, feeding Vala, checking for any new drafts around the barn, and ensuring that last night's slush hadn't refrozen into dangerous ice. Though Gideon itched to move about, he allowed himself the small respite, sipping the tea and marveling at Lily's gentle efficiency. He recalled how once he might have bristled at accepting help, but time and hardship had taught him humility. Pride might warm the ego, but not the barn, and certainly not a horse who depended on him. After chores, Lily settled onto a wooden crate beside Gideon, flipping open her notebook. She wanted to finalize details for the story she planned to submit to the regional magazine. "I've got photos of Vala training, shots of the barn, and a few quotes from you," she explained, tapping her pen thoughtfully. "But it'd be really meaningful to include something from your own past, how you ended up at that auction, what drew you to Vala." Gideon shifted uneasily, his knee protesting. He rarely spoke of his early life, of the years spent drifting from one odd job to another, perpetually on society's margins. Yet Lily's gentle eyes and the memory of everyone's kindness pried open a door he'd long kept shut. He spoke in halting words, describing how he'd lost the small farm he once owned due to mounting debts and misfortune. He recalled the day he stumbled upon the horse auction, intent on finding cheap labor, or perhaps just a living creature to remind him he wasn't alone. Then he trailed off, watching Vala chew his feed with quiet contentment. Lily jotted notes, but never pushed when Gideon paused. When he finished, she thanked him softly. "People need to see the full picture," she said. "It's about more than just rescuing an animal. It's about rescuing each other, in a way." After Lily left to drop off her article notes, Gideon decided to attempt a short exercise session with Vala. The pain in his knee flared every time he bent to attach the halter, but he gritted his teeth. In the barn's open space, he coaxed the horse into a gentle walk around a row of wooden rails. Vala's ears swiveled attentively, picking up Gideon's faint cues. Despite his injury, Gideon managed to guide Vala through a few tight turns and even a brief trot. He clung to the rope, determined not to stumble. Each successful step felt like a small triumph, as though horse and man leaned on each other for balance. Word of Lily's magazine feature spread quickly through the town's small population, and it wasn't long before Esther came by with news. "They're interested," she declared, brandishing a letter sealed with a tidy emblem. "They want to run the piece next month, plenty of time before the spring fair." Gideon released a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The thought of public exposure still unsettled him, but if the story brought donations, or at least changed a few minds about neglected horses, then perhaps it was worth it. He gazed at Vala, remembering the hollow, half-dead creature he'd first brought to this barn. Any discomfort he felt at being in the limelight was dwarfed by the possibility of giving hope to others in similar straits. As winter waned, the injured fence behind the barn finally emerged from beneath layers of melting snow, revealing the patches Gideon had hastily nailed together. The sight made his heart sink. The boards were warped, and in one corner, the nails had slipped. Determined to prevent future disasters, Gideon spent a painful afternoon reinforcing the entire stretch. Hammer in hand, he climbed a rickety ladder, ignoring the protest of his bruised knee. Each blow echoed across the yard. Whenever he paused, leaning on the ladder for support, Valor whinnied softly from the corral, as if urging him on. By dusk, the new plank stood firm, a testament to his stubborn resolve. During these grueling weeks, an unexpected arrival brightened their days. A small package arrived from Morris, the traveling veterinarian. Inside, Gideon found additional herbal supplements. A short note encouraging him to keep Valor's immune system strong through the seasonal change, and a jar of salve for treating Gideon's own aches. Though the label read, "for external use," Gideon couldn't help but smile at Morris's thoughtfulness. He applied the salve to his knee each evening before bed, convinced it eased at least the sting of the bruise, if not the deeper pang of living with so few resources. Every small kindness felt like a nudge to keep going. With the snow receding, Gideon expanded Valor's training into the pasture beyond the barn. They worked on transitions from walk to canter, practicing halts on command and occasionally setting up makeshift obstacles using fallen branches or old barrels. More than once, Gideon's knee buckled, forcing him to lean against a fence post until the pain subsided. But Valor's growing enthusiasm spurred him forward. The horse seemed to relish these sessions, nostrils flaring with excitement whenever Gideon fetched the halter. Though far from perfect, their partnership bristled with a gentle determination. Step by step, Gideon found himself considering the possibility of attending the spring fair in earnest. The day Lily returned with a draft of the magazine article was the first properly warm afternoon of the season. Sunlight cascaded across the yard, and patches of green grass peeked through the damp earth. Lily bore a stack of papers and a grin. "You should see this," she said, holding out a few printed pages. The headline read, "From Broken to Beloved, One Man's Devotion to a Neglected Horse." Gideon felt his cheeks burn. It sounded so dramatic. Yet as he skimmed the text, he recognized the sincerity in Lily's words. She'd woven his sparse anecdotes and Valor's progress into a tapestry of resilience. The photographs showed Valor's transformation with stark clarity. One image captured the horse's guarded stance at the auction, contrasted with a recent shot of him trotting proudly beside Gideon's watchful gaze. "They'll finalize it soon," Lily said, tapping the edge of the page. "This is just a rough layout, but the story is there. People will read it and see how much he's overcome." Gideon nodded, his heart pounding. The prospect of strangers learning about his struggles felt both humbling and terrifying. Her memory floated up unbidden, the rancher's scornful grin, the cruel jests from onlookers as Gideon handed over his last dollars for a horse deemed worthless. He shook the thought away, reminding himself how far they'd come. In the following days, Gideon found a quiet resolve. He spoke with Esther and Lily, agreeing to bring Valor to the spring fair after all. "Not for glory," he told them firmly, "but to show that even if a horse looks broken, that doesn't mean he can't stand tall." Lily offered to help with transport arrangements, while Esther promised to gather any extra supplies needed for the trip. Gideon envisioned the fair's open arena and the bustling crowd. He also pictured the possibility of harsh judgments, the sneers that once cast his resolve into doubt. Still, Valor deserved a moment to shine. With the decision made, Gideon focused on preparing Valor for the fair's environment. He introduced the horse to recorded noises, cheering crowds, distant music, to acclimate him to the chaos of a public event. Valor flicked his ears nervously at first, but Gideon's calm presence soothed him. Each evening, they repeated these exercises, bridging the gap between the relative hush of the barn and the din they might face in a ring. As Valor's confidence grew, Gideon felt a tremor of pride stir within him, mingled with the ever-present weight of responsibility. They had triumphed over hunger, cold, and doubt. Maybe they could endure the scrutiny of strangers too. In the warmth of an early spring sunset, Gideon stood at the pasture fence, knees still aching, but heart brimming with cautious optimism. He watched Valor graze, the horse's coat catching golden light. The idea that they might soon demonstrate their bond before a crowd no longer felt absurd. Instead, it felt like a fitting next step. He recalled Lily's words. It's about rescuing each other. Indeed, in nursing Valor back to health, Gideon had also saved himself from giving in to life's bitter defeats. Now, as a new season beckoned, Gideon wondered if maybe, just maybe, this fair would mark the start of something brighter still. Spring arrived in careful increments, thawing the edges of winter's hold. Every morning, Gideon stepped outside to find more patches of exposed earth, the snow receding in ragged shapes. Though his knees still ached if he moved too quickly, the improving weather made daily chores far more bearable. At dawn, he fetched water for Valor without trudging through drifts, and the fierce winds that once rattled the barn had become gentler breezes ushering in fresh air. Even the barn felt different, a place of transition rather than struggle. In this gentler season, Gideon found himself increasingly focused on the fair looming just weeks away. His decision to show Valor, quietly, modestly, had settled into a firm resolve. He didn't crave attention, but he believed now that their story might carry a spark of hope for any who cared to see. In the days that followed, Lily began visiting more frequently, sometimes with Esther in tow. The two women joined Gideon in the pasture behind the barn, where the ground had softened enough for Valor to trot freely without skidding on ice. Gideon took the rope halter and encouraged the horse through practiced movements, guiding him around circles and asking for smooth transitions. Lily observed with camera in hand, snapping pictures while Esther offered small bits of advice she'd gleaned from years of casual horse handling. They marveled at Valor's steady improvement, noting how the once fearful stallion kept his ears forward, responding to Gideon's voice more than the tension of any rope. Their excitement was contagious, and Gideon felt a tremor of pride whenever Valor executed a graceful turn or halted on a whispered cue. Word had indeed spread that Gideon intended to bring Valor to the upcoming fair, which promised to draw a large crowd from neighboring towns. Though most folks seemed intrigued, Gideon heard rumors that the rancher, whose sneers had haunted him since the auction, had taken renewed interest. The rumor said the man might appear at the fair himself, parading a team of well-bred horses. Gideon tried not to dwell on that possibility. He refused to let the rancher's disapproval spoil the quiet triumph of showing Valor's resilience. Yet the memory of their tense confrontations lingered, serving as a reminder that not everyone would cheer for a horse rescued from the brink. With the sunshine and warmer temperatures came a small but steady trickle of local visitors. Some had read the early version of Lily's article in the rescue group's newsletter. Others were simply curious about the old man and his once-neglected horse. They would stand by the fence, watching Gideon's training sessions, sometimes offering words of encouragement or tokens of support. A half-bale of decent hay, a jar of homemade liniment. Gideon accepted these gifts with quiet gratitude, aware that each gesture chipped away at the mountain of expense and effort. To his surprise, a few families even brought children who petted Valor's neck under Gideon's watchful eye. Each gentle pat felt like one more step away from the bruised life Valor had known. Between chores, Gideon continued scribbling notes in his dog-eared ledger, charting Valor's progress. He recorded the horse's improved appetite and how quickly he'd learned to stand calmly while Gideon brushed him. Spreads of new grass in the pasture provided fresh nourishment, and Gideon alternated that with hay to keep Valor's diet balanced. Every now and then, Gideon would reread Lily's draft article, now awaiting publication in a regional magazine, and marvel at how the words captured not just Valor's transformation, but also the subtle shifts in Gideon's own life. He supposed he had changed too, forging a stronger sense of purpose than he'd had in years. If their story brought a sliver of hope to anyone else, that alone justified braving whatever judgment the fair might bring. A week before the event, Lily arrived bearing an official program that listed various contests, demonstrations, and parades slated for the fair. One category, a small showcase for rehabilitated horses, seemed tailor-made for Valor's debut. No trophies, just a chance to share his story, Lily explained, pointing to a short description in the booklet. Gideon exhaled in relief. He had feared a high-pressure environment where Valor would be judged harshly against pedigree or polished performance. Instead, this sounded like an informal space where the pair could demonstrate trust and progress. The idea steadied his nerves. If all went well, Valor would walk into the ring, respond to a handful of cues, and trot out again, a simple display of teamwork, but for them, a defining moment. During that final stretch of preparation, Gideon devoted hours each day to refining Valor's manners and composure. He led the horse around makeshift obstacles, introduced him to random noises, banging buckets, distant music on a crackly radio, and even asked friends to clap or cheer when Valor moved gracefully so the horse would grow comfortable with sudden sound. More than once, Valor startled, reverting to the old tension that had once controlled him. Yet Gideon's calm reassurance and gentle hands brought him back from the brink. Each successful exercise ended with a soft pat or a slice of carrot, leaving Valor more confident than before. At night, when Gideon collapsed onto his cot, his knee throbbing and back stiff, he reminded himself that these efforts were the difference between Valor thriving in public or succumbing to fear. The morning of the fair dawned clear, with the sky awash in pale gold. Gideon could hardly believe how quickly the season had changed. Tufts of grass swayed in a gentle breeze, and the air smelled faintly of blossoms. Lily arrived early to help load the trailer, carefully positioning bales of hay and water containers for the journey. Esther, too, came bearing a hamper of sandwiches and apples, ensuring Gideon wouldn't forget to eat in the excitement. Valor snorted and hesitated at the trailer ramp, but a few murmured words and a reassuring touch coaxed him inside. Gideon felt a swirl of nerves, equal parts anxiety and quiet determination. This trip was more than a ride. It was a passage toward the uncertain spotlight. They set out along the winding road that led to the fairgrounds, passing fields tinged with spring's first blooms. Gideon drove slowly, mindful of the trailer's swaying weight and Valor's comfort. Lily followed in her own vehicle, carrying a camera and extra supplies. Every mile brought them closer to the moment Gideon had feared and anticipated in equal measure. Upon reaching the fair's entrance, they joined a line of trucks and trailers, each carrying a different story. Gleaming show jumpers, sturdy draft horses, and everything in between. Gideon's breath caught at the sight of sleek animals decked in polished tack, led by owners wearing crisp riding attire. He glanced down at his own plain shirt and threadbare jacket, wondering if he'd stand out as a fool. Then he pictured Valor's dark eyes and told himself that appearances meant little compared to heart. After parking, Gideon unloaded Valor cautiously, scanning the bustling fairgrounds. Clusters of people weaved among various rings and stands, while loudspeakers announced upcoming events. Vibrant banners fluttered overhead, and the scents of fried pastries mingled with fresh hay. Valor snorted at the commotion, stepping sideways in momentary alarm. Gideon steadied the rope, offering a soft hum that had become a signal of safety. Slowly, the horse's breathing slowed and his ears tilted forward, absorbing the unfamiliar setting. Lily joined them, smiling in encouragement. "You two have got this," she said, her voice firm. They stabled Valor in a small covered pen, which Gideon lined with straw carried from the trailer. He double-checked that the water bucket was secure and that no loose boards might spook the horse. Nearby, other participants groomed their animals, chatting about pedigrees and training regimes. Gideon felt a whisper of insecurity stirring, yet Lily's confident presence and Valor's calm acceptance fortified him. At a makeshift desk, a fair official handed Gideon a slip of paper with the showcase schedule. They were set to appear in just a couple of hours. Gideon's stomach twisted, but he reminded himself this was about showing progress, not chasing accolades. Time crawled and flew simultaneously. Gideon alternated between carefully brushing Valor and pacing in anxious circles. He watched as families strolled past, many pausing to admire the wide range of horses. Whenever someone asked about Valor, Lily stepped in, offering glimpses of their story with a practiced ease that left Gideon both grateful and slightly overwhelmed. He was no showman. His gift was patience and quiet belief. Yet Lily's readiness to speak on his behalf reassured him that Valor's story wouldn't go unheard. More than once, Gideon caught a glimpse of well-dressed owners casting cursory glances at Valor's stall. Did they recognize him from the article? He couldn't be sure. When the call finally came to gather for the rehabilitated horse showcase, Gideon's heart thudded. He led Valor toward a small ring, cordoned off by rope barriers, noticing how the midday sun gleamed on the horse's coat. A hush fell over Gideon's mind, as though everything beyond this ring ceased to exist. He felt the rope in his hand, the heat of the day, and Valor's strong presence beside him. Lily positioned herself by the entrance, camera at the ready. Beyond the rope, spectators milled about, some with mild curiosity, others with phones poised to capture the moment. Gideon swallowed hard. This was it, the culmination of every laborious day and sleepless night. He stepped into the ring, Valor at his side. Applause broke out, tentative but genuine, for the handful of participants entering with their own rescued horses. Gideon blinked against the brightness and forced himself to breathe. Someone with a microphone began speaking, introducing each story. Then came the simple request, "Demonstrate what your horse can do." Gideon inhaled, exhaled, and lifted his hand. Valor moved forward, ears alert, stepping gracefully into the center of the ring. Gideon forgot the crowd, forgot the rancher who might be watching, forgot even his own throbbing knee. All that mattered was Valor's trust, forged through fear and faith. They had come so far. Now, beneath the sun's warm rays and the gaze of strangers, it was time to let that triumph unfold. He raised his hand gently, and Valor moved forward with a smooth, measured step, ears pricked in alert focus. A hush seemed to cloak the ring, as if the crowd sensed the significance of this moment. Though Gideon's voice was barely audible, the horse recognized the calm authority in each subtle cue. At a light prompt, Valor trotted a neat half-circle, then halted precisely when Gideon lowered his arm. The routine was modest, no leaps or high-stepping flourishes, yet it showcased a bond forged through countless hours of mutual trust. For a few heartbeats, the arena felt like their private world, enclosed by empathy and quiet determination. A ripple of applause, hesitant at first, spread among the onlookers. Lily, standing off to the side with her camera, grinned broadly. She captured each step and turn, the lens focused on how seamlessly horse and man moved together. Gideon let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. His knee throbbed under the strain of standing so still, but relief swelled in his chest. The demonstration was going exactly as he had hoped. Simple, honest, a testament to how far valor had come. Every clap from the crowd, every small cheer, felt like a validation of the months spent in labor, doubt, and faith. He offered a soft word, and valor turned again, ears flicking attentively at the gentle murmurs rising from beyond the rope barriers. Though the fairgrounds bustled with activity, announcements over loudspeakers, children's laughter, the whinny of other horses, valor's composure held. Gideon reminded himself to breathe steadily. This was precisely why they had spent weeks familiarizing valor with sudden noises and unfamiliar crowds. A flashbulb popped somewhere at the rail, and the stallion jerked his head a fraction. But Gideon soothed him with a reassuring hand along his neck. Slowly, valor relaxed, muzzle lowering in trust. The hush gave way to more applause, a genuine appreciation from spectators who had never witnessed this pair's struggles, but could see the triumph in each calm stride. After one final pass, Gideon stopped in the center of the ring. He bowed his head slightly, acknowledging the small circle of watchers. Though no formal ribbons or trophies were offered in this rehabilitated horse showcase, the supportive applause meant more than any prize. At the rope's edge, Lily wiped the corner of her eye, beaming like someone whose own faith had been redeemed. Gideon, aware of how cameras and smartphones aimed their lenses at him, guided valor toward the exit with quiet dignity. He might have walked away then, satisfied with the demonstration, until a presence materialized by the gate, blocking their path. The rancher stood there, immaculate hat perched at an angle, his polished boots incongruous with the dusty fairground. Gideon felt a jolt of tension. He remembered those derisive words back at the auction and the bitter taunts at the smaller fair in autumn. Now, as the rancher met valor's steady gaze, Gideon braced himself for renewed ridicule. But instead of sneering, the man offered a measured nod. His eyes drifted over the horse, noting the muscle gained, the repaired scars, the easy way valor held himself. For a moment, he said nothing. Then, in a voice low enough that only Gideon could catch, he muttered, "Never imagined he'd turn out like this." Gideon inhaled slowly. The rancher's tone carried no overt scorn, and for an instant, a flicker of regret or respect seemed to pass through his features. Onlookers, sensing a potential confrontation, edged closer. Lily's hand hovered protectively at Gideon's elbow, but Gideon raised his chin. "He always had it in him," the old man replied, voice calm but firm. "He just needed someone to see it." The rancher's jaw tightened. Perhaps he intended to extend another offer, to flaunt money or question Gideon's next move, yet he remained silent, tipping his hat instead. With that, he stepped aside, granting them passage. Lily exhaled in relief, guiding Gideon and valor away from the ring. The crowd parted, some patting valor's flank or calling out kind words. Gideon blinked against the brightness of midday sun, faintly overwhelmed by the swirl of sensations. Applause still echoing in his ears, the rancher's unexpected civility, and the warmth radiating from valor's solid presence. He led the horse to a quieter corner of the fairgrounds, near a water trough. There, he loosened the halter slightly, letting valor lower his head to drink. Lily joined them, her eyes shining with pride. "I think that went better than any of us expected," she said. Nearby participants with their own rescued horses approached, some eager to compare stories of transformation, others simply wanting to meet the pair they'd heard so much about. A middle-aged woman introduced a mare she'd saved from a neglect case. Another man spoke of adopting retired racehorses. Gideon, though never one for chatter, felt a kinship in these confessions. They were all part of a quiet army, believing in the potential hidden beneath battered exteriors. Each handshake or nod reminded him that he and Valor were no longer alone in this journey. News of the demonstration traveled quickly through the fair. Before long, a staff member asked Gideon if he would mind stopping by a small stage where short interviews were being filmed for local coverage. Gideon's instinct was to refuse, uneasy with publicity. But Lily placed a hand on his shoulder, urging him gently. It might help others see the value in giving horses like Valor another chance, she said. Gideon looked at Valor, who had finished drinking and now gazed at the bustle of the fair with mild interest. Perhaps Lily was right. If even one more person chose to save a neglected horse rather than dismiss it, the inconvenience of an interview was worthwhile. So he found himself standing on a rough wooden stage, Valor beside him, while a local reporter with a microphone asked polite, curious questions. Gideon spoke haltingly at first, describing how he'd spotted Valor at the auction, how no one else saw the horse's worth. He recalled the cold winter nights, the battered barn, the feed bills he could barely pay. The reporter listened intently, pausing every so often to let the camera pan across Valor's calm demeanor. When asked what kept him going, Gideon hesitated. His gaze drifted from the microphone to Valor's deep brown eyes. "I guess it was simple," he said softly. "He needed someone, and so did I." That line seemed to resonate, prompting applause from the small crowd that had gathered around the stage. Embarrassed, Gideon ducked his head. It felt surreal to share such personal truths in public, yet Lily beamed, and more than one onlooker dabbed at damp eyes. As the interview wrapped, the reporter thanked Gideon for his courage and reminded viewers to look out for the upcoming magazine feature. Overwhelmed by the attention, Gideon stepped down from the platform, Valor following without hesitation. Together, they retreated toward the stabling area, where Esther waited with a gentle smile and a fresh bucket of water. By late afternoon, the sun dipped lower, gilding the fairgrounds in a soft light. Gideon fed Valor a modest meal, ensuring the horse had time to rest before their return trip. A parade of show horses, sleek creatures with braided manes, marched through the main arena in a final display, accompanied by trumpets and fanfare. Gideon watched from a distance, hands resting on the fence. He had no envy for those glittering spectacles. He found more meaning in the quiet pride that radiated from Valor's well-fed frame, in the knowledge that the horse stood unafraid in a setting that once would have triggered terror. When they finally reloaded Valor into the trailer, Gideon felt a surprising calm settle over him. The noise and chaos of the fair faded behind them as they drove away, Lily following in her car, headlights appearing in the mirrors whenever dusk slipped across the roads. Gideon replayed the day's events in his mind. The applause, the rancher's unspoken concession, the handful of people who approached with genuine interest. For so long, he had braced himself against derision or heartbreak. Now, it dawned on him that they had won something intangible, a sense of acceptance or maybe even redemption. Arriving back at the barn by twilight, Gideon helped Valor step carefully onto the familiar ground. The horse sniffed at the evening air, letting out a soft snort as though glad to be home. Gideon's knee ached, but his heart felt strangely light. With Lily's assistance, he removed Valor's halter and led him into the corral. A few stars already glimmered overhead. "Good job today," Gideon murmured, running a hand along Valor's neck. The horse nudged Gideon's shoulder, a gesture that might have meant trust or gratitude or both. Nearby, Lily said her goodbyes, promising to return soon with any updates about the magazine's final publication. Alone once more in the settling darkness, Gideon propped his elbows on the corral fence. It struck him how different this night felt compared to the one when he'd first brought Valor home, battered and half-starved. He recalled the mocking voices from the auction, the coarse laughter that said no one would waste a dime on a horse like this. Tonight, he thought of them no longer with anger, but with quiet triumph. Valor had stood in the public eye, unafraid, and left an impression of possibility. Gideon had found not only a worthy companion, but also a spark that reignited his hope in second chances. The barn light glowed dimly, and somewhere nearby, a spring wind whispered through budding branches. Valor ambled over to the water trough, still wearing the faint sheen of sweat from his performance. Gideon considered the road they'd traveled, the storms, the injured knee, the near-empty pockets. But none of that weighed on him now. He couldn't predict the future, couldn't say how many more fairs they'd attend, or if their story might fade with the next season's headlines. Yet he felt deeply that whatever challenges rose on the horizon, they would face them together. And that, he decided, was enough. Sore and tired, but filled with a quiet joy, Gideon turned toward the barn, leaving Valor to savor the night air. The old man's boots crunched on gravel, each step infused with an unspoken promise. The bearded outcast who once scraped together his final coins for a seemingly worthless horse was no longer defined by scorn or pity. He had proved, if only to himself, that appearances failed to measure true value, and that the bonds formed by care and courage could outshine even the darkest expectations. As Gideon closed the barn door behind him, the moon rose steadily above, illuminating a path where judgment had given way to hope. Together, they had walked it, and neither would ever walk it alone again.